Long before electric heat and coffee shops, America faced a winter so bitter it silenced cities. Rivers froze like mirrors, fields turned white, and people measured time by how long their candles could last. This is not a story of heroes. It's a slow frozen memory of a nation learning how to survive its own silence. In the spring of 1816, people looked to the sky and saw something wrong. The sun, that familiar golden circle, had lost its warmth. It glowed weakly, like a candle burning through fog. The days stayed cool and the nights came early. No one knew it then, but far across the world a volcano named Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted with a roar that shattered mountains and filled the upper atmosphere with ash. The sky above America, though calm, was quietly poisoned by that distant fire. The year began like any other. Farmers in New England tilled their fields, planning for corn and wheat. Families opened windows to let in the scent of spring. Children ran barefoot through muddy yards, laughing as they chased the first butterflies of the season. Yet something felt strange. The mornings were colder than they should have been, and the light had a grayish tint, as if the world had been placed behind glass. By May, the buds on the trees hesitated to open. Frost came and went like an uninvited guest. The air smelled of smoke, even when there was no fire. Cows grew restless. Birds migrated in the wrong direction. People blamed superstition or sin or the end of the world. The newspapers were silent. They had no explanation, only small reports from Europe saying the weather there had also turned bitter. Then came June. In a season when the earth should have been warm and green, snow fell, thick, white and soft. In Vermont it covered fields like a shroud. In New York it dusted rooftops and melted into cold puddles on the cobblestone streets. Farmers stood by their barns and watched the impossible happen. Corn seedlings, barely an inch tall, froze solid overnight. Cabbages turned black at the edges. Apple blossoms so full of promise collapsed in the frost. There were no storms, no thunder, no drama, only silence and the sound of melting snow. The air felt thin, as though the breath of the world had slowed down. Those who lived through it remembered the color of the sky, a dull, smoky yellow that dimmed even the brightest noon. The horizon faded into haze, and the sun, when it appeared, looked like a pale coin. The sky was the color of ashes, one farmer wrote in his diary, and even the birds refused to sing. By July, panic began to whisper through the towns. In Boston, prices of grain tripled. In Maine, fishermen found ice floating near the coast. In Pennsylvania, travelers told of lakes freezing overnight. People slaughtered livestock early, fearing there would be no hay for winter. Families huddled around fires in the middle of summer, wrapping themselves in blankets that smelled of smoke. It was not the kind of cold that killed suddenly. It was the kind that lingered, that crept into bones and stayed. Nights stretched long and dreamless. Children coughed. Old men stared into empty fields. The year moved forward, but the seasons refused to follow. In upstate New York, a farmer named Eli Hutchins tried to replant his corn 3 times. Each time, frost claimed it. On the last attempt, he gave up and built a small smokehouse instead, curing what meat he had left. His wife boiled nettles and wild roots to feed their children. The family survived, but barely. Across the region, people told stories of neighbors packing up their wagons and heading west toward Ohio, chasing rumors that the weather there was warmer. Many never returned. Churches filled with anxious prayers. Ministers preached of divine punishment. The dark summer, they called it, a test from God. But others spoke quietly of science. Some travelers brought news that the strange weather was global, that crops in Europe had also failed, that famine was spreading. Nobody had heard of Mount Tambora yet, but the ash it had thrown into the sky was drifting everywhere, reflecting sunlight back into space. dimming the world like a half-closed eyelid. Even animals seemed confused. Flocks of geese flew north in August, searching for warmth that no longer existed. Bears wandered closer to farms. The sound of crickets, the heartbeat of summer nights, was gone. The earth had gone still. In New England, candles burned all day inside homes. People read by firelight at noon. The rhythm of life slowed to a whisper. Letters from the time describe a grey mist that never lifted. "I cannot tell morning from evening," one woman wrote. "The sun rises without warmth and sets without color. It feels as if we are living beneath the end of the world." And yet, even in the cold, life found strange ways to continue. Some people adapted. They learned to plant potatoes instead of corn, to dry fish and berries for the winter. In Vermont, a young writer named Mary Shelley, visiting Europe that same year, looked out upon a sky filled with ash and wrote the first lines of Frankenstein. The darkness, it seemed, inspired not just fear but imagination. Back in America, 1816 continued to drift forward, day after grey day. The year refused to end. In September, a frost killed the last of the surviving crops. By October, snow returned again, earlier than anyone could remember. People had begun to forget what warmth felt like. The wind whistled through cracks in cabins, through the bare trees, through the fields that once sang with crickets. Children grew quiet, listening to the long hum of winter arriving before its time. When spring finally came in 1817, it was cautious, like someone stepping onto thin ice. The snow melted slowly, revealing the bones of the lost harvest beneath it. Grass returned, but it was pale and brittle. Still, the people worked. They tilled, they planted, they hoped. The sun began to shine again, faint but steady. It had been a long sleep, a cold grey pause in the history of the young nation. No monuments were built for that year. No wars were fought, no heroes rose. Yet in a way, the year without a summer changed everything. It pushed families westward, seeking new soil. It reminded Americans that even their growing country could be humbled by nature's breath. It taught them patience, the kind that only cold can teach. And so 1816 faded into memory, a whisper of frost on a nation's timeline. The farmers who survived went on to rebuild. Their children told stories of the summer that never came. The skies cleared, the fields grew green again, and the sun regained its golden strength. But sometimes, on especially cold mornings, when the mist clings low to the valleys and the air smells faintly of smoke, it's easy to imagine that grey year again, the year when the world seemed to pause, when time itself held its breath, and America learned what silence really sounded like. When the sky turned grey and the sun lost its heat, hunger crept in like fog. It did not arrive all at once. It came quietly at night in the sound of empty cupboards and the long silence before a meal. The summer had already failed, and by the time the first frost of autumn touched the fields, America was beginning to starve. In the farmlands of New England, men walked through fields that looked burned, though no fire had touched them. Wheat stood frozen in mid-growth, thin and brittle. The heads of grain were pale ghosts, hollow shells that shattered when crushed. Corn stalks, once tall and green, had turned grey at the edges, bending under frost that glimmered like glass. Even the animals seemed confused. The cows refused to graze and chickens stopped laying eggs. The rhythm of life, planting, growing, harvesting, had been broken. Apples turned black on the trees before they could ripen. The few that survived were sour and dry, good only for boiling. Women gathered what they could, slicing the damaged fruit into thin pieces, drying them near the fire. The air smelled faintly of smoke and rot. When the first snow came in October, it covered the fields like a clean white sheet laid over a body. Families began to burn what they owned to keep warm. Wooden chairs disappeared one by one. Tables, tool handles, and fence posts vanished into the fire. In small cabins, the air was thick with the smell of wet wood and desperation. People tore the doors from unused rooms, broke apart wagons, and fed everything to the flames. The light of those fires flickered through windows, small stars of survival scattered across the dark hills. Hunger made people quieter. Conversation shrank to whispers. Neighbors who once shared bread now hid what little they had. A pot of thin soup became treasure. Children licked bowls clean and watched their parents pretend to eat. Mothers told stories to distract them, tales of warm summers, of harvest dances and apple pies. The stories were soft and slow, but every word carried the sound of longing. The winter deepened. The roads froze. Supply wagons from the south could not pass through the mountains. Letters stopped arriving. The world seemed smaller, wrapped in ice. In towns across New York and Vermont, families began trading whatever they owned. A quilt for a sack of oats, a set of boots for a jar of lard. Money had no meaning. Warmth was the only currency that mattered. In some places, the churches opened their doors to the poor. Inside, people slept side by side on straw mats, wrapped in blankets that smelled of smoke. Ministers prayed for mercy, their voices echoing in the cold air. Candles burned until their wax froze into dull shapes. The sermons grew shorter. There was nothing left to say except that spring would come somehow. For those who lived on farms, the silence of that winter was worse than the hunger. Every sound carried: the crack of a frozen branch, the moan of wind through the chimney, the slow creak of ice forming on the roof. Night after night, people listened to their houses groan under the cold. They lay awake, counting heartbeats, waiting for dawn. And when the sun finally rose, it brought no warmth, only light, pale and thin like the memory of fire. In January of 1817, the temperature dropped even lower. Wells froze solid. Cattle died where they stood, their bodies preserved in ice. Horses grew too weak to pull sleds. The scent of death was hidden under the clean, sharp smell of snow. People scavenged through barns for anything edible: corn husks, dried beans, seed grain. Some boiled leather straps, softened with ash to fill their stomachs. Every meal was a small victory, every mouthful a quiet act of faith. Yet even in that bleak season, moments of strange beauty appeared. Ice crystals hung from window panes like delicate lace. The nights were filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The snow reflected the moonlight until whole valleys glowed silver. In that ghostly light, families sat together around tiny fires, speaking softly or not at all. The world outside was deadly, but inside, there was still the rhythm of breathing, the quiet miracle of being alive. One farmer in Massachusetts, his name long forgotten, kept a journal through the worst of it. His handwriting trembled, but his words endured. "We are hungry but unbroken. Each morning we wake, and that is something. The cold is an enemy we cannot fight, only outlast. My children sleep close, and I dream of green fields that may come again." His entry for February was only 2 sentences. The frost took the rest of the apples. I burned the bed frame tonight. In towns like Albany and Concord, groups of neighbors began to meet at night to share what little they had: a pot of porridge, a loaf of coarse bread. They sang hymns in low voices, not out of joy but out of stubbornness. The songs carried through the air like faint hope. In the absence of sunlight, people began to generate their own warmth through kindness. It was quiet, invisible heroism, the sort that never reaches history books. When March came, it brought not relief, but more snow. Storm after storm rolled over the hills. By then, most people had stopped expecting rescue. They learned to endure, to wait. Waiting became a kind of prayer, slow, heavy, and endless. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as if deciding whether to begin again. And then one morning in early April, something changed. The air softened. Icicles dripped. Birds, thin, silent ghosts, began to reappear on the branches. The snow, which had lain heavy for half a year, began to sink. Beneath it, the first blades of grass appeared, fragile but green. The sun, though weak, finally felt warm again. People stepped outside their cabins, shielding their eyes against the brightness. They stood in silence, listening to the faint sound of melting. Water ran down from the hills in thin silver threads. For the first time in months there was motion, the sound of the earth waking up. Many cried without knowing why. Hunger had hollowed them, but the sight of life returning filled that emptiness with something like peace. That spring the fields were planted again, carefully, hopefully. The soil was poor from the frost, but the farmers worked with quiet determination. They did not speak of the past winter. It was too heavy, too strange. They simply moved forward, one seed at a time, trusting the sun to remember them. Years later, when the story of 1816 was told, people remembered the volcano, the ash, and the cold. But those who lived through it remembered something smaller. The taste of the first warm meal after the frost. The smell of bread baking again. The first morning they could step outside without fear of freezing. The hunger had been terrible, but it had also taught them the shape of gratitude, sharp, humbling, unforgettable. The frost of hunger passed, but its memory lingered like a shadow on the land. Even now in the valleys of New England, when the first cold winds arrive and the air smells faintly of wood smoke, some say the old silence returns. A reminder of that gray year when food vanished, the fires burned low, and America learned how thin the line is between endurance and surrender. Every meal since then, every harvest, every sunrise of a mild summer morning, is a quiet forgiveness. A small mercy granted to those who once waited in the dark, praying not for abundance but simply for another day. The winters kept coming, not as cruel as the one that had stolen the summer of 1816, but still cold enough to make people remember. They learned to listen to the wind as it passed over their chimneys, to measure the months not by warmth, but by how long the frost lingered on the windows each morning. America, still young and fragile, entered a quieter age, one lit not by the blaze of battle or revolution, but by the faint, steady glow of candles. By 1817, the air had softened, but memories of hunger lingered like ghosts. Every household prepared for winter, with the caution of survivors. Cellars filled with dried corn and salted meat. Families cut wood through autumn until their arms ached, stacking it in neat, hopeful towers beside the house. Women sewed thicker quilts. Men repaired roofs and patched the cracks that had widened in the cold. The rhythm of life slowed. There was no rush anymore, only routine, patience, and the quiet prayer that spring would not forget them again. In small towns across New England, new habits were born. People began to build houses with thicker walls, layers of logs sealed with clay, lined with straw for insulation. Iron stoves replaced open hearths, their hum becoming the heartbeat of every room. The sound of firewood crackling was a comfort, a song of survival. Families would sit around those stoves after dark, speaking softly or not at all, the orange glow flickering across their faces like candlelight on still water. Candlelight itself became the symbol of the age, small flames that defined the boundary between darkness and hope. In the evenings, when the wind howled and the world outside turned silver with frost, houses glowed like lanterns scattered across the hills. Inside, the light was steady, golden, forgiving. People read by it, prayed by it, stitched clothes, and remembered summers they were not sure would return. Children grew up in that dim light. They learned their letters by tracing words under candles that dripped slowly down to wax puddles. The smell of tallow and smoke filled the air, the scent of warmth earned through patience. Mothers told stories while mending torn sleeves. Fathers sat silently, carving handles for tools that would last another year. The world beyond the windows, dark, cold, and endless, became less frightening when met with the steady flicker of a flame. There was a beauty in the simplicity. The pace of life was slow enough to feel the turning of each day. When snow came, it was greeted not with fear but with quiet acceptance. It blanketed the land, smoothing away the scars of famine and failure. In towns like Concord, Albany, and Hartford, people began to say that winter no longer felt like an enemy. It was a teacher. It reminded them that survival was not about strength, but steadiness. The farmers who had once watched their crops die in gray light now studied the weather like scholars. They built better barns, dug deeper wells, and stored grain in sealed barrels. They understood the moods of the earth, when to plant, when to wait, when to trust. The land that had once betrayed them became familiar again, something they could endure. And while the frost still came each year, the people who lived through it changed. They no longer expected comfort. They built it themselves. Every firelit was an act of defiance against the cold, a declaration that life would continue, quietly but completely. In towns, the winter evenings became seasons of community. Neighbors would walk through the snow carrying lanterns to share meals or exchange stories. Churches held candlelit gatherings, not of mourning but of gratitude. Hymns echoed through wooden walls, voices rising gently like smoke. The songs were soft, not triumphant but tender. They spoke of light that did not need to conquer darkness, only outlast it. Somewhere in a farmhouse in Vermont, a woman named Abigail wrote to her sister, "The light is dim, but it stays. Every evening I light a candle and think of the summer to come. It takes longer each year, but it always comes. We have learned to wait without fear." Her words could have belonged to anyone in those years. America was learning endurance not through politics or invention, but through patience, through the quiet discipline of those who refused to give up warmth. Even in the cities, the glow of candlelight marked the hours. In Boston, street lamps burned whale oil instead of flame wood. In Philadelphia, scholars and tradesmen worked late into the night, their rooms lit by trembling lights that cast long, thoughtful shadows across their desks. Books were written in that dim light. Poems, sermons, letters of love and faith, all shaped by the calm rhythm of the flame. Between 1817 and 1820, the winters began to ease. The snow melted earlier, the rivers thawed sooner, and the sky, once gray and lifeless, started to blush again in spring. The sun returned, and timid at first, then stronger. But by then the people had changed. They no longer relied on its mercy. They had learned to build their own warmth. America was becoming something new, not just a nation of independence, but a nation of resilience. The lessons of that cold decade were buried deep in the soil and in the spirit of the people. They had seen how easily life could vanish and how quietly it could return. Progress, they realized, did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered through the creak of a rocking chair, through the hum of an iron stove, through the slow burn of a candle on a long winter night. Children born after the year without a summer grew up with stories of their parents' endurance. They would hear how entire towns survived on turnips and hope, how fires burned through furniture, how hunger taught humility. And though they would never feel that same fear, they inherited something deeper, a sense that light, however small, was worth protecting. By 1820, new inventions began to change the rhythm of life again. Glassmaking improved. Windows grew larger, letting in more light. Iron stoves became more efficient. Candles burned longer, brighter, cleaner. But even as progress arrived, people still paused each evening to light a single flame. not because they needed it to see, but because it reminded them of survival. It was a ritual now, a small ceremony of memory. A candle on a table, a family gathered close, the sound of a clock ticking. The warmth spreading softly through a room that once knew cold too well. In those moments the silence felt kind instead of cruel. The country, once young and frightened, was learning how to rest. Some historians later called it the era of good feelings, a period of calm after revolution. But in the homes of ordinary people, it was remembered differently, as the time when light returned one flame at a time. The years 1817 to 1820 were not marked by heroes or wars, but by the simple endurance of a nation that refused to be extinguished. Even today, when the power goes out and candles are lit in modern American homes, that old feeling stirs again, a trace of that quiet age when survival was not loud or proud, but patient. A reminder that civilization itself was once built on the small, trembling courage of people who chose to keep a flame burning in the dark. It didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden burst of sunlight, no triumphant chorus of warmth reclaiming the land. The change came in whispers, a soft dripping from icicles, the slow cracking of rivers that had slept for years, and a pale, golden tint that began to bleed back into the sky. People were afraid to believe it at first. They had seen too many false thaws, too many mornings that promised warmth and ended in frost. But this time something was different. The air had a gentler weight. The light lingered longer on the snow. It was as if America, after years of holding its breath, was finally beginning to exhale. For years, the land had been a landscape of stillness, the fields frozen, the barns silent, the very air brittle with hunger. But as 1820 dawned, small miracles began to appear in ordinary places. A river in Vermont loosened its icy armor. A patch of green grass appeared near a cabin in upstate New York. Birds, thin and trembling, returned from the south, testing the thaw with cautious songs. In Massachusetts, a farmer named Daniel Shaw swore he saw the first robin of spring and ran to tell his wife as though the Messiah had arrived. The people were desperate for signs, for proof that the world had not forgotten them. And when those signs came, they didn't cheer. They simply stood in quiet awe, afraid that too much noise might scare the warmth away again. The return of spring didn't erase the scars the long winter had left. Many farms were gone. Whole families had moved west, seeking gentler skies. In the towns that remained, church bells rang not in celebration but remembrance for the neighbors who hadn't survived the cold, for the children who had vanished into fever and frost. Every surviving home carried its own small museum of endurance, a cracked iron stove, a candle stub that burned through the darkest night, a wooden spoon carved from a broken chair leg. People kept these things like relics of a quiet war, reminders of what it had cost to keep living. And yet, as the soil softened again, something ancient awoke in them. Farmers touched the earth like greeting an old friend returned from the dead. The smell of thawed dirt was sweeter than perfume. Women planted seeds with trembling hands, whispering prayers that had gone unsaid for years. Children laughed again, real laughter this time, not the hollow giggles that came from hunger's delirium. When the first shoots of wheat pushed through the ground, neighbors gathered to watch, their faces lined and worn but lit with something bright, belief. In Boston and Philadelphia, city folk celebrated differently. Merchants reopened markets that had been shuttered by scarcity. Bakers filled the air with the scent of bread once more, a smell that made people stop mid-street and close their eyes. Churches overflowed on Sundays, not out of duty but out of gratitude. The sermons were not about sin or salvation but survival, how endurance itself had become a kind of grace. The preachers spoke softly, knowing that faith had already proven itself in every frozen night their people had survived. There was a strange beauty to that fragile spring. The rivers didn't rush. They crept forward. The wind carried both warmth and memory. In the evenings, people sat by open windows listening to the thaw. The dripping water, the soft rustle of new leaves. These were the sounds of resurrection. Across the fields, candles still burned, but now their light was joined by the flicker of fireflies. The contrast was haunting and holy, the stubborn human flame and nature's quiet return of her own. The frost had taught America patience, a kind of collective humility that no victory or war could ever give. People learned that survival wasn't about strength alone, but gentleness. Helping a neighbor, sharing a crust of bread, keeping a candle burning when there was no reason left to believe it mattered. That winter had burned away arrogance, leaving behind something purer, a slower rhythm, a deeper gratitude. Years later, old men would tell stories of the year without a summer and the winters that followed. Their grandchildren would listen with disbelief, unable to imagine a world where snow fell in June and the sun seemed to disappear. But the old ones would simply smile. They didn't tell the stories for drama. They told them as reminders that the world can grow cruel, but it always softens again, that no storm lasts forever. That warmth, like forgiveness, always returns. By 1822, the land was alive again. Crops grew tall. Rivers ran free. And yet, the people who had endured the endless cold did not return fully to who they were before. They walked slower. They spoke softer. They thanked the sun as though it were a guest that might leave again. In letters and journals from that time, you can feel it. A nation that had been humbled into grace. They no longer took comfort for granted. Every loaf of bread, every warm night, every newborn calf or blooming tree felt like a miracle earned, not given. Spring didn't just warm the land, it mended the spirit of a country that had nearly frozen from the inside out. In the quiet thaw, America remembered something profound, that life, even when stripped to its coldest core, always wants to begin again. And so, when the last of the snow melted into the ground, and the first thunderstorm rolled gently across the hills, people stood in their doorways and listened. The sound wasn't frightening. It was beautiful. Because after years of silence, the world was finally breathing again.